Hey folks, Steve here with the next installment of our Korea Fire and Ice video series. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the setup for the campaign game. And first things first, I want to kind of show you how I have the game set up. So I have the map sitting on two 3 foot by 3 foot tables stuck together. My sort of table configuration stuff tends to work well for big maps like this because I can, take things apart, I can move things together, I can kind of work it a couple different ways. So I've got it set up there. I do have some extra table space that I could put some of the player aid charts on, but I do want to try to create sort of an island setup for this one since I'm going to be kind of moving around the map a whole lot because it is so big and I need to get to both sides of the map easily. So I sort of have a allied command position over here. So I have the UN player aid marker and the UN air sheet over there covering up part of the ocean that won't be terribly important for game purposes for the most part. I've got a few of these soy sauce dishes which will hold various markers that we don't need, and I do have a couple of cups that I'll put certain chits in, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I do have one of the player aid charts over here, again in sort of a blank space where there's not a whole lot going on the table. Makes that easy. There is a terrain chart here, so I kind of don't need the backside for that. In the center of the map, I do have, the communists don't have as much room to work with on the other side of the table, so the communist player aid is right here again in some water space that won't be terribly important. I've got the rules sitting there for the moment, and then over here, the communist air display over there in China, where there's not a whole lot going on, and the other player aid sheet with the terrain chart. There's a little bit of space there that may be used for game purposes that's covering. I can move stuff around. But that seems to work pretty good, and I've got plenty of space to kind of wrap around the table and come back and catch things at different angles. So we'll look at it that way. And you can see I've got all the counters and baggies and stuff. I'm going to get things unbagged, and we'll talk to each component as we start getting set up here, and I can describe how things work. I am going to be trying to clip my counters along the way, so as units are set up for the first time, I will clip their corners. So everything, as of right this second in this recording, I'll still have the standard corners from punching the counters, but as I use each counter, I'll clip them, and probably by the end of the playthrough, everything will get clipped, even the markers that I ended up not using for whatever reason. Before I get into the actual setup, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sequence of play so that you kind of understand, even if you don't watch much more in the series, the flow of the game. This is printed from the 3.0 rules, 3.0A rules, and you can see the game is structured that you have weekly phases, but you also have monthly phases. So this is, as you can imagine, something you do on the months. So as you can see over here at the turn track, here's June, just one weekly turn. And you don't do a monthly turn at the beginning of the game, I don't believe. But then we have July, so you would do a monthly turn phase where you do monthly stuff, and then each subsequent week turn over here, you do the week, the regular turn for a week, before you get to August, and you do monthly stuff. So you don't do everything all the time. You do, these monthly phases at the beginning of a new month, right? So the basic sequence for a weekly turn is going to be fleet redeployment. So the UN player can move the fleet around. They will be able to do an invasion at some point once per game. They can do some sea evacuation, the UN player, the reinforcement phase, which every scenario in the book is provided a reinforcement schedule, and I'll show that. And then we have a checking of lines of communication, which is done pretty much at the beginning. You'll see kind of the oddity here is that the UN does this at the beginning of a turn, so they end their turn in each given weekly phase without checking for communications, but they do it at the beginning of the turn before the communists start taking their actions. It's kind of interesting. Their set of actions are split up where the communists are kind of straight through here. So you check for lines of communication, you do some refreshing. That is where we flip counters from their spent side to their fresh side. Again, there's no reduced units. The flip side of a counter is not a reduced unit, it is a spent unit. And then the communist gets their strategic movement phase, their activation phase where they activate HQs, and then units that are within range of those HQs for movement and combat, then they check their communications, see? And they do their refreshing as required. And then the UN player gets their side, similarly strategic movement activations. And then you get to the end where you do a reset phase. So again, you can see that the refresh and communications are done, it's split for the UN across 2 turns basically, where the communists get their whole string of 4 main actions within a turn. Kind of interesting how it's set up that way. At the end of each turn, then you do the eliminate friendly units phase, so you can voluntarily eliminate units. Units that are eliminated that way go into the replacements box, meaning they are units that can be rebuilt, but there are penalties. So you don't want to just do that. It's not giving you free replacements. What it is it's putting the unit back in your force pool to rebuild, but you still have to spend resources to rebuild it. So don't just think you're getting freebies when you voluntarily eliminate a unit. Victory check, so we're going to look at victory point markers. I'll talk more about that later. And then you advance the week marker. When it's the beginning of a new month, you determine the weather for the month. That's going to depend on what month you're actually in. You're going to look at some foreign intervention stuff. You're going to look at infrastructure and supply, and aircraft recovery and reinforcement, aircraft repair, Air Force's commitment, air support phase, strategic air missions phase, top cover phase. And so if you can't tell just by me covering that list, most of your air stuff is going to happen on the weekly turns. So in a given set of turns, like what happens in that monthly sequence with the aircraft will kind of govern what the air superiority or air situation is through those subsequent handful of turns until the next month. So at the beginning of the game, we won't have that. There'll sort of be some air units that are set up in a specific configuration for that first weekly turn. And then when we get over into July 1950, that's when we'll start getting into the actual air stuff, air mechanics. Just to show, again, this is the 3.0 rules and the setup that we're going to be using. We are looking at what starts on page 38 of these rules, the scenario number 4 campaign game. And you can see there's some background. It's the whole game. It's going to run through September of 1951. I do think it's interesting. There are other games on the Korean War that, where you choose to end the game is all a little bit different. Like I think there's the game just called Korean War. That's an old classic that's being reprinted by Compass Games soon that ends in like May or something of 1951. This one uses all the maps, which we have set up. The weather for the first turn is clear, but then we start determining weather normally. Here are the victory conditions. If either side achieves 21 victory points, that's an automatic victory. The communists can win by basically seizing all of Korea and seizing all the amphibious invasion ports. So that's going to include, I believe, Busan. So that just assumes a total communist victory. And then neither player wins, it's going to be whoever has victory points at the end of the scenario. So that's going to be some interesting stuff when we look at the victory point markers and how that subsystem works. Kind of interesting. And then here's some special rules. So on the first turn of the game, the communist player has surprise attack. So there are certain benefits where they'll be able to pick combat chits. And we haven't even talked about combat chits yet. But basically, via this surprise attack, communist player is going to have some increased effectiveness for the opening turn. Communist player controls all the hexes north of the border. UN player controls all those south. That's probably pretty obvious. And then when a VP is awarded to the communist player after air-to-air combat in Meg Alley, roll a d6. 66% of the time, the 4FI aircraft enters play as a reinforcement. It is placed in the available aircraft, blah, blah. So something we'll need to remember. This might be something I could easily forget, so I'll do my best to remember that. And then for the setup, the UN sets up first. All UN HQs and units begin the game spent because of the surprise attack, so they'll all be on the backside, and all communist HQs and units begin the game fresh. Now, the rest of this setup, you can see it's organized by units on the map, stuff on your player aid card, and then stuff on the air display, and that's provided for both the UN forces and the communists. You can see boom, 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 and then there's some additional map set up for those objective markers, the victory point markers. So we'll look at that as we go, and then the rest of it, of the defined scenarios, are going to be your reinforcements, withdrawals, and adjustments. You can see on the very first turn, as part of the monthly stuff, the UN player is going to get a bunch of air-related goodness, and then in the subsequent turns, you can see the UN player is going to get different things added to support, and we'll talk more about that here very, very shortly. The communist player also getting various units, so you can say NK7, NK41, NK10, and so on. Additions to support levels on the player aids, and so on and so forth, all through the rest of the game. So you really will be looking at that section of the rulebook each turn to see who comes in where. And I guess I'll need to decide how I want to set up the reinforcements ahead of time, if I can do that easily somewhere and set them up on the turn track or something like that. I might want to do that. So, okay, that's an intro to this video, and an intro to the setup. We're going to look at each of those setup sections in detail, so you guys kind of see what's going on. Before I do that, I do want to say, like, I was trying to figure out how long is this campaign game going to take, and how long will we be doing this playthrough series. I think the box says something like 12 hours. So as far as Korean war games go, because of the goal of this being less complex or easier mechanically to play on the table, it will probably be the shortest of any set you might see. So by comparison, like OCS Korea could take, and this is just based on searching around because I've not played OCS Korea yet. If you try to play the whole campaign there, you might be looking at 100 hours. If you're playing the Korean War game, the old classic that's being reprinted here very, very soon by Compass Games, I think that can take somewhere over 20 hours for the whole campaign. So this game might be the shortest playing one of the bunch if you're going for the campaign game, but we'll see where it goes. And I would just keep in mind, for those who don't watch my videos very often or are unfamiliar, my videos will tend to be long because I spend a lot of time talking about the game and talking about mechanics and talking about the strategic situation. Because of that commentary, and because I'm talking about each thing I do on camera, the length of my video should not be seen as an indicator of how long the game takes. So if you try to add up, like my last video series, all the hours of each video all together, you get some hour number. That's not necessarily what you'll have if you're just playing the game. You may take a lot shorter time because you're just playing through. You might take longer because you're thinking through things much longer than I chose to. So it's going to be hard. I will try as we get towards the end to say altogether how many actual gameplay hours I think it was, but I'm not going to be doing a hard count for that. So something to keep in mind. We'll see. It'll certainly be a multi-hour affair, I think, any which way we cut it. But the exact length, I guess, we'll discover. If we trust what the box says, it's going to be somewhere 12 or more hours across the whole thing. But again, we'll see. So okay, let's start with the on-map setup for the UN forces, specifically the Republic of Korea, really, units on the map. So let's transition over that way. Okay, so this is the UN on-map setup for the moment. And just to kind of show where we're looking at here, so you can see we have Republic of Korea forces 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, a capital unit, and 2 HQs, the first and the second Corps HQs. So where are these guys all situated? Well, you can see the white border here is the sort of country border here. Your first Corps HQ is down here in Seoul. The second Corps HQ is more off to the east near the front line, or the border rather. About to become the front line for about a hot second before they get pushed back. There is the capital unit in the capital, right? Makes sense. And you just have these handful of units, 1, 2, 3, 4, that are actually at the border or near the border itself. And as you look at sort of the main road connections through here, this unit's sort of defending this road line to the capital. This guy's sort of watching this path, these guys this path, and then one far out on the right on the east coast. There does seem to be, a gap here that would be lovely to exploit, I'm sure. Those are not the only units that are on the board. There are technically 3 in the southern part of the country, in Taishan, in Taegu, and Gwangju. I'm sure I'm going to butcher some of these names, and I will feel horrible each time it happens. But these are sort of garrisoning some of the major city areas in the southern part of the country. Now, I would expect that as the action starts, those guys are either going to want to try to defend somewhere or hold these cities or fall back or do something. Now, obviously, the one challenge is going to be, as we look at this, that all these units are spent. So they are flipped over to their backside. There's actually a pretty stark color difference between those that are full strength, or I'm sorry, fresh and unspent. So it's like this is more of a tan color, and it becomes a much, much lighter tan color when flipped over like that. So it'll be pretty easy in most cases to be able to identify if the unit is spent or fresh. Easy to spot. And that's it. That's all the UN player has on the board at the beginning. And you can imagine it's going to be pretty easy for the communists to kind of surge over the border. And what you should probably think about is that where those counters are the greatest representation of where the UN player has forces, right? We're not talking, big stacks of individual counters. It's, that's a division, or I think they're roughly equivalent to a division, and they have a ZOC and all of that kind of stuff. But that, where they're positioned are where the forces are. And we'll talk a little bit about how like replacements play into that idea. But, basically we have garrisons in the south, something holding the border, and some stuff in the capital, and that's it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the UN Player Aid card, and let's talk about the initial setup for that and talk through a little bit about what those individual things mean. Okay, so we're going to look at the on-player aid card part of the setup instructions. So as you can see, there it is. Republic of Korea replacements are 4, a lot of zeros, infrastructure and supply at 5, and then a lot of zeros. So not a whole lot for us to add, but is relatively straightforward to do. And I've done that on the player aid sheet already. Now, this might be a good time to point out why you might not throw out the rule book that came with the game, because it does have a handy-dandy little chart showing you kind of which markers are which in terms of the color and which faction they represent. So not everything is split across factions, but things in this game, like replacements, are green for the U.S., blue for general UN forces, and then tan, light brown, whatever you want to call that, for Republic of Korea, and then the different shades of red for China and the Soviet Union. So that might be, don't just toss this away. You probably want to use it to just validate that the markers are what you think they are and for what you think they are. Later games in the series do split up the different support markers, so you can have tank support for a different faction. In this game, as the first game in the series, it's a little more simplified, where only replacements are split up, and things like artillery support, tank support, and so on are basically shared. And the distinction between, is that a North Korean tank or a Chinese tank, you don't really see portrayed on the counter. You just sort of need to know that, I guess. An improvement, in the next game in Vietnam and beyond, where they were a little more specific. The design was more specific about which factions have which support, even if they can all be used the same. Just sort of, I guess, historical flavor, understanding where they come from. That's an improvement. So we'll deal with the mishmash here. Not a big deal. So let's talk about what these things really mean. So we have 4 replacement points, specifically for Republic of Korea units. What does that mean? Well, we'll get into the in-depth bits of combat, But what essentially will happen is when there is a combat, the two sides will roll dice, will add a variety of modifiers, and the difference between those rolls will be the sort of combat margin, or the gosh, now I can't remember the name of what it's called. Anyway, the important thing is you have a difference, and that might be 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I believe in this game, 5 might be the maximum that you can have. The loser, the person who rolled the lowest value after all is said and done, has to do something with that loss factor, that difference. And there are different ways to spend that. So if you get, let's say, a 3, you can spend some of that 3 by retreating a hex or 2. That might take care of some of it, but then you may have some left over that you might have to give up via a victory point, or replacements. And so replacements are going to be, for sure, a well-desired place to lose those combat points, because retreating a lot can have some negative effects to units becoming disrupted or routed, which can make them much easier to destroy later, and can cause all sorts of other problems for you. So where possible, you probably want to take some of those loss factors off your replacement points. So here we have 4. So if we had a combat and it was, say, a difference of 1, assuming those units of ours that were defeated had a line of communication, we could take that 1 step loss from replacements and go down from a 4 to a 3. That just representing that the units, or the men, the soldiers in that division, however many were lost in that combat, are replenished from other soldiers that are in reserve or coming out of training, and they are situated back into that division without having a very long process of creating a replacement point counter and moving it to a reduced unit and flipping it to a full strength unit or something like that, like you might see in other games. This is just a simplified version of that, assuming that, yes, those units, those soldiers will get to the unit that has experienced losses in combat. So the Republic of Korea starts with 4, so they can handle. it's not a lot, but it is something. So that we don't have our on-map units instantly vaporized, because they can't do anything else. But you will find in some combats potentially that because a unit can't retreat or it can't do much else, you're going to take those step losses or those loss factors by eliminating units. And I do think this is a guess until we get into the thick of things, that is very bad to actually lose a unit on map. You want to avoid that. You lose that because you not only have just lost units, you don't have as much ability to attack yourself, but losing that whole unit opens up a huge sort of like operational movement gap on the map that the enemy is going to exploit. So that's important. We also have supply and infrastructure. So what these things represent are, obviously, supply is ammunitions and rations and all those sorts of things. Infrastructure is how well those supplies can get places. And infrastructure is a very abstract way of representing the condition of roads and all that kind of stuff, right? Infrastructure. The way it works in the game is that you spend supply points to, flip HQs from a spent side to their full side. So that is how we fix our spent status as the Republic of Korea. We spend supply points, and they can also be used to repair airfields. So it is basically a currency that you will be spending. I believe it's on every monthly turn, you look at your infrastructure, and your supply will be brought back up to your infrastructure. So as long as you keep your infrastructure in good shape, you will be able to maintain supplies. But if your infrastructure is bombed due to enemy air missions and your infrastructure lowers, then your potential maximum supply will also lower, and you will be debilitated that way by the enemy in a strategic fashion, right? Kind of interesting how that will play out. You get more infrastructure adds to your track via reinforcements. So over time, it's just sort of representing repairs and improvement to infrastructure as the war goes on. So the UN player just starts with 5, and they'll have to make do with that until additional support comes in the way. The rest of their markers are all 0. So US bombardment, US amphibious is all 0. Their combat support is all 0. So there's really 3 main types that you'll see in most ground combats. It's going to be artillery, tank, and air support. Obviously, the South Koreans, the Republic of Korea, had a lot of problems at the outset of the war where they didn't really have much in the way of armor or an air force, and so they start with very little here. You'll see that the communists start in a much better position, but the way that the support tracks really work here, and they would be put down on this row, is that you're going to have some level of support, and that is a abstraction and a representation of some number of artillery, some number of tanks, and effectiveness of your air units doing ground striking will provide, for a space on the track, right? Some number. Now, it's really hard to kind of gauge, is a support level equal to some level or some number of actual tanks? In some ways, it seems to be somewhat relative, but I will say, due to the way that the math works out, that the closer to 0 you are in a given support function, kind of the worse off you are, and that having 4 compared to 0 is, those two, 4 is actually closer to 0 than 8 is to 4. Because the way it works is that when you do a combat, there's a readiness penalty. So and this is getting a little bit into the way the combat system works. You can choose the type of attack that you're performing, and if it's a hasty attack or it's a well-prepared attack, depending on how much movement the attacking units did, you're going to have a different penalty. So the more prepared you are, meaning your units that were in place are attacking maybe an adjacent unit, that's a deliberate attack and will have a lower penalty. That penalty is subtracted from your support level, and then depending on the terrain that you have, that's going to further determine what your actual bonus to a combat die roll is. So, if you have 4 tank support, you might have an attack that has a readiness penalty of 3. So 4 minus 3 is just 1. The only way you'll be able to use that 1 support is if you're attacking terrain that has a 1-for-1 exchange for support levels from there. So it's sort of an A minus B in parentheses divided by C calculation. I should have written that out in a Sharpie on a piece of paper and showed you. But it's actually kind of straightforward, and it just makes sense that your artillery and your tanks are amongst your controlled areas, right? And your assignment of tanks and artillery will just be based on how prepared you were for the offensive that you designated and whether or not those units are there with you. And the numbers are all a little different and a little funky. You can look at the charts in the book, but that's a very brief description of that. So there you go. The support markers for the UN forces are all done. The final thing that the UN has to worry about is their on-air display. But as you can see, no aircraft, airfields, or markers start on the UN air display. So as I have that just off to the side right here, there is nothing there. But you can see we'll eventually have airfields in South Korea as part of our carrier battle groups, Japanese airfields, and all the rest. So that will get populated here soon, just not for the beginning of the game. So there you go. The UN is all set up. Pretty straightforward stuff. But now we need to take a look at the communist setup, and I will say they are much better off. Okay, so here is the North Korean, communist player, but obviously North Korean setup. They have 3 HQs that are set up a little ways behind the border, and you can see a fair concentration of forces in a variety of spots. So it's kind of interesting that we can sort of have way out here a HQ and a unit, and there's just not a whole lot around other than, there's like a town over there, and then that's sort of the end of that particular peninsula. But you have face-to-face with one of these spent units here, the HQ, a cluster of divisions there, which are kind of pointed towards the capital, and units over all around here, right? And the HQs pop behind. And you can see just about in every case, if you wanted there to be a 2-to-1 advantage in terms of just number of units, you certainly have that. There are combat bonuses for having additional support for multiple units attacking a hex, and it gets like exponentially better the more units you have. So attacking from 2 hexes is better than 1, but 3 is much better than 2, and 4 is a lot better than any of the others. But in almost every case, you can kind of see where we would be able to get 2 against 1 almost everywhere, right? This guy and this guy maybe attacking him. These 3 attacking here and heading south. These 2 against this guy, and these 2 against that guy, right? It's sort of like that would appear to be some of the obvious ways to operate, and then it just comes down to, where all are we attacking, and what kind of actions do we want? Is it better to eliminate a standing unit by removing its ability to retreat and removing it, or is it better to just force them back if it means getting farther in the amount of time that we have? To be honest, I'm not really sure. I'm really not sure what the better plan is for the game system. I suspect that me eliminating these units and making it harder for them to come back on the board is probably the better long-term option, but it might slow me down from seizing some of the critical towns and areas that would be needed as the North Koreans. So we'll kind of see how all that plays out. It is these opening phases that I have once played on Vassal a long time ago, and I don't remember much from those days. That was quite some time ago. It was mostly me just testing out the combat system, but I don't remember what was a good decision or a bad decision, or what really makes sense to try to achieve here. So, I could see where I make the mistake of spending too much time fighting along this border when I could be surging down south. Just what is my risk appetite for doing that? We'll figure it out as we go. All right, so with that, let's take a look at the communist player aid setup, which is going to be a bit different than the UN player. Okay, so here is the communist player aid with the setup instructions. So you can see much better off than the UN player at the beginning here. The North Korean replacements are at 8, so they have a much higher loss tolerance, generally speaking. The Chinese and Soviet replacement markers are technically 0 and off the track for the time being, just for cleanliness. And the supply and infrastructure are at 12, so quite a bit more. They have a lot more supplies for reactivating or refreshing their HQs, which will help the North Koreans drive through South Korea, through the Republic of Korea. For support levels, they actually have some, which is a distinct difference between the two sides at the beginning. The artillery and air support for the North Koreans is at 4. The tank support is at 6. And as we talked about in terms of the calculation for bonuses, let's take tank support, for instance. Well, if we have 6, we might have an attack that has a penalty of 3. So 6 minus 3 is 3. And then, depending on the terrain we're attacking in, those 3 left over are either going to be used 1-for-1 for bonuses or on some other ratio. So if it's a case where, like, we're attacking a town, that's a 3-to-1, 3-to-1, whatever you want to call it, division. So if we were attacking a town and used tank support, and it was a -3 for the attack type, 6 minus 3 is 3. 3 for 1 for a town, so 3 support left over from that turns into a +1 bonus to the attack. If we were attacking in clear, then it would be a +3 because it's a 1-for-1. So 3 after the penalty subtraction, 3 for 3. Basically 1-for-1, 3 for 3, 3. A bonus of 3 with a 3 support left over. So you could see the difference between like artillery and tank, meaning given the same attack and maybe the same penalty, a 4 minus 3 just leaves you with a 1, which means you may not even get to use artillery in a town combat, for instance. That's kind of the way it shapes out for the way calculating that support. So once you understand that calculation, it's very simple, but of course we have to get used to all of that. So there you go. There's the communist player aid setup. Very straightforward. At the beginning here, they have some stuff. The UN doesn't. That's going to be a pretty great advantage in the early game. So now let's head over to the on-air display for the communists, where we will actually have some air stuff to look at. Okay, here we are with the setup for the air display for the communists. You can see we actually do have some stuff on here to look at, as opposed to the UN again. So here we are designated as having one North Korean airfield. So I just have a regular airfield here. If it was damaged, it would go into the damaged airfields box, but it is just the one with a identifier of number one airfield in North Korea. It is possible, you can see, to have airfields in China. There's a separate box for that. And the way, we'll get into this in more depth later, but basically you can have a certain number of aircraft operate from a particular airfield, assuming it's not damaged. And because the first turn of the game starts with the communist basically activation phase or movement phase of the game, it's assumed that the monthly phase for June 1950 has already occurred. So with that, 2 air units have already been set to particular missions, and they've been set to tactical missions. So we have the first FAR here, and you do get it's a Yak 9P is the model of aircraft that represents, or a collection of aircraft that is predominantly Yak 9P. And then similarly, we have the first AAR, which is an IL-10, and the first is set to top cover, so you can see that as sort of air superiority type of situation here, top cover, and then the actual ground support, so supporting attacks, and that's kind of where our air support value is derived from on our support sheet. Now, what you can see, just like land units, is that air units, air counters, do not have factors on them. And instead, what you need to do is reference this capability chart. So if this were any other game, they would just stick these numbers on the counter. But for this, you look at your air display capability chart, and you can see there's an air-to-air ability, which is used in MiG Alley and top cover, and the different types of planes have different values. So the Yak 9P, for instance, has a 2 value noted here. So we would use the 2 value when adjudicating activities for top cover. The IL-10 has, for tactical missions, a 4 value, while if it was doing a strategic mission like infrastructure strike or airfield striking, its value would only be a 2. But we have a 4 here specifically. So 4 for ground support and interdiction missions. So they're uncontested. There aren't any other UN planes flying top cover or dealing with MiG Alley, that sort of thing. So there's not much to do other than to know that those units are set up that way and will be operating at least for this very first turn of the game. So there you go for that. Obviously, this will change very much over the course of the game. The Allies, or the UN, I'm going to keep saying Allies, I'm sorry. The UN player will continue to get more aircraft. The Communist player will get more aircraft, but it will predominantly be in the form of Chinese aircraft. And there's a whole bunch of Chinese air units that can come in and support the North Koreans, but they will always be trying to fight against the UN, and we'll see the whole air war kind of shuffle out from there. So yeah, that's it for that setup. And there's just one last section of the setup that we need to take a look at, which is specifically the additional map setup section, which is talking about objective markers. So let me kind of switch the camera up and take a look at that. Okay, so the final part of the setup is that additional map setup, and it has to do with the objective markers. So the objective markers are kind of an interesting mechanic, right? We looked at the scenario instructions, and we kind of understand, well, hey, if the communists can take all the invasion ports, they can win. Otherwise, the faction that has victory points at the end is the winner. Well, how does that work? Well, the victory points can range from 21 plus. You can get over 21 victory points, though 21 is what's required for automatic victory. Somewhere between 21 victory points for one side, then that can go back down to 0, and the other side can get up to 21 and beyond for victory. But the victory point marker will always be somewhere either at 0 for, smack dab in the middle for 0, or more likely on somebody's sort of side of victory points. Maybe you can look at this sort of like, if you're familiar with Twilight Struggle or something, you can have 0 victory points or negative or positive, and that's better for one side or the other. But how do you actually get those victory points? Well, there's a couple different scattered ways to get victory points, some having to do with other mechanics. The principal way that you're going to get victory points is with objective markers. So I have a set over here that I have all face down because they're meant to be hidden. And the instruction was to place one randomly chosen hidden, meaning even I don't currently know what the value is, hidden communist objective marker on 6 specific hexes. On the back side of these markers is a VP value. So if you're able to get that objective chit on the map, you can reveal it, capture it, achieve it, claim it, and you will get the number of victory points on the reverse side. So if your opponent has victory points and you achieve an objective, you decrease their victory point value. If you have positive victory points and you're achieving victory points, you increase, and so on and so forth. Pretty straightforward stuff, right? You would think so, anyway. Now, the initial placement of these victory point markers are in pretty obvious locations. So let's take a look at where those are currently set up at the moment. So to start with, we have one in Incheon and one in Seoul. So that's 2 right off the bat in the sort of close proximity of the border, and obviously are pretty important locations. We also have markers, and they're kind of underneath some of our South Korean garrisons, but they are placed in Daejeon and Daegu. And then we also have one, we have one each in Masan and Busan. So basically, if you kind of look around the map, most of the major cities currently have objective markers on them. So what do you do with those guys? Well, if you reference the rule book, there is a section that covers the victory point segment. And I had to double check the page number. It is page 15 of the latest rules PDF. So basically, when you're at the victory check phase, both players will take an action, and first the communist goes, then the UN player, and you have to perform one of these actions that I'm going to list out here, and I'll try to do so quickly. But if for some reason you can't do it, either because you're out of markers left to draw, because all of your markers are out there on the map, or some other reason, you will lose a victory point. And so what this means, essentially, is you can't get away with just placing a bunch of objectives and never achieving your objectives. You will decay, and your opponent will win that way. But the basic idea is wherever the front line is on the map, wherever you're progressing to, you're aiming to get those objectives, get the victory points, and continue on to get to another objective. So of the one action that you can take per reset phase and a victory check phase, you can claim one friendly revealed objective marker on the map that has no enemy units within 3 hexes. You collect the victory points and place the marker back in the pool. So if we knocked some of these South Korean units out and we captured Seoul and there weren't any other Republic of Korea units nearby, we could claim that objective in Seoul if it was revealed. You can also remove an enemy objective marker that has a friendly unit in the same hex. Place the marker back in the pool. So potentially, if the South Koreans are able to hold those important cities and the North Koreans never get down there, the UN player could decide as their one action to take one of those objective markers where they have a unit garrisoned and send it back, send it out. You can draw a random friendly objective marker and place it face down. I believe that means hidden, not face down. Which side is the right face, right? I think that is supposed to mean hidden. Place a random friendly objective marker and place it face down on any hex that, in one case, I might as well just show you guys, right? has an enemy unit in it, and is a port or city hex, right? So a garrisoned important place, we might think of that, or is any enemy-controlled hex of Pyongyang or Seoul. So basically, you're going to say, I'm going to assign a new objective, and it's either going to be a capital city or it's going to be an important place that already has a unit in it. The next option, draw a random flanking objective marker and place it on any town hex that is both occupied by an enemy unit and within 3 hexes of a friendly unit. So that's sort of like a shorter term objective goal, I guess, right? There's plenty of towns. They're the yellow marked hexes throughout the map. So you would be placing it on any town that is both occupied by an enemy unit and within 3 hexes of one of your units. Short-term objective, you could look at that. And then finally, the action is reveal all friendly objective markers that are adjacent to at least one friendly unit. So what's interesting is, like, it appears like even if we capture Seoul and we take those hexes, we're not going to just get the victory points right away. It appears what we need to do is spend one of our objective marker segment actions as the North Koreans, revealing objective markers that we've gotten to, and then we need to sort of spend our one action in a future turn, a future weekly turn, claiming the ones that we've retained. So that's interesting. So the way this really works, and I'm trying to think through the flow of the game, is that obviously you're going to put these objectives on important places that are by some definition important. And then you're going to take them, right? You'll have them revealed, and then there's some intermediate amount of time where the other side could try to counterattack and take that marker back from you before you can actually claim the victory point. So there's an element of designating a place to advance to, and then holding it long enough to claim the victory points for it. So it is a territory over time mechanic, I guess you could look at it. Though in some ways, I kind of wonder at some of the descriptions here in the cases, like draw an objective marker and place it on a hex that has an enemy unit and is a port or a city hex. Well, what if there are no enemy units in port or city hexes, right? What if they're just outside of it and are purposefully doing that so that you can't claim you can't put down an objective marker? But I guess that means your alternative option is to put one on a town someplace, but that town has to be occupied by an enemy unit. So is there some way to cheat the system by putting units adjacent to towns and cities but not placing them in there? Is there any value in doing that? I don't know. You could probably just snake around those units and capture them anyway. But if you capture a city or a town without an objective marker, you're not necessarily getting victory points. So I don't know how that's really going to work out, and it might be something worth pressing as we play through the game on the mechanics to say, can I like gamify this a little bit? Can I cheat and kind of keep the North Koreans from getting objectives, period? Some of this might be moot because there's already plenty of good objectives out there on the map that the North Koreans are certainly going to be trying for. So it may not really matter a whole lot. But it is something I'm going to watch, because I remember when I first took a look at this game, trying to wrap my head around the objective markers and kind of how they're used and what's the right way to do it is really unclear. In some ways it's like, what else do you do? And if you can only take one of these actions, do you ever get stuck in a situation where you place a marker and then your opponent uses their action to remove that marker that you just placed? Somewhere, I guess, pending game conditions, you've got to pick something other than that, I guess, right? So we'll figure that out. That's the one thing I'm kind of curious on, just how will the objective marker system operate in actuality. But yeah. Okay, guys, there you go. We are set up. We're ready to rock and roll. And look, I mean, how much stuff... Okay, I've got a lot of stuff on the map and sheets everywhere, but how much stuff is really out and set up? A couple of counters over there. Yeah, we've got our front line defined, but there's not that many counters, period, right? And a few things over there, a few markers on some player aid charts, and that's really it. I spent more time explaining what these things are than actually placing these things, right? But I hope this is helpful in, you know, helping you understand kind of the framework of the game before we get started, right? You understand what the support levels are, you understand how the units look and work, and you have some idea of the air mechanics, but we'll certainly get into that in much greater detail in some time to come. I'm going to keep rounding my corners as we go. I've made some good progress. There's still a lot of chits left to clip. But in the next video, we will start with the very first turn, and we'll play through, and we'll see how far we get, and we'll see just how it goes. I'm not sure how many turns I'll be able to fit into an individual video, but if it follows some of my previous rhythms, we'll probably have maybe a turn per video for a while I show individual mechanics as they come up. But as we get toward the later part of the game, I may speed things up and do less on camera and just kind of play through the rest of the narrative of the playthrough, so that this isn't a series that goes on for months and months and months, right? That's the goal. That's what we'll look at doing. So thanks for watching. I've gotten a little bit of feedback already that recording with my phone is the better option. So I will continue to record the series with my phone, with my tripod that I got for my phone. And you guys will enjoy much better video and audio quality. Really happy about that. I'm glad we're making this work, guys. Much, much better. My only regret being I've had this phone for quite a while, and I could have been recording many of my previous videos this way, and they would look a lot better. And instead, they look grainy and awful. So I apologize for that, but we're on the right track now. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Keep on gaming. We'll see you in the next one for turn 1.